Exactly. And I think AI is a very good example in terms of everyone has an over-awareness of it because it impacts our everyday. Maybe if accessibility isn't impacting your everyday, you're not as aware of it. Just because it's not impacting you doesn't mean that it's not impacting your attendees and the way in which they attend our events.
Hello and welcome to the meeting room. I'm Paul Harvey. Accessibility has become one of the most important subjects in our sector over the past few years. But are we thinking about it in the wrong way? And are we considering the expectations of different generations? I'm joined today by Freya Foster from Principal Global Events, who believes accessibility shouldn't be an add-on or a compliance exercise, but built into events from the very beginning. She also says that the younger generation sees accessibility not as a nice to have, but as a baseline expectation. So today we're going to explore why designing for inclusion ultimately creates better events for everyone. But before that, a quick word from our sponsor.
No apologies, no hesitation. Toronto's all in, 100%. You want to reach high, catch a vibe, meet where the energy is electric and the inspiration is endless, where ideas are born, collide, and multiply. Whatever it is, our answer 100 times over and 100 times again is 100%.
Freya, welcome to the meeting room.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, you recently wrote a piece for M&IT called Accessibility by Design, Why Gen Z Expects More from Events. Why did you want to write it?
For me, it comes from a lived experience. So I know the impact that it can have when everyone's thought about. For example, so I have dyslexia, and if I'm attending an event and my neuro-inclusive kind of support needs are thought of, then it allows me to engage with the event the same way in which, everyone else there is, all of my colleagues and my peers. For example, I struggle with sort of processing if I'm in a keynote room, for example, and I'm wanting to take in all the information. I struggle with listening and kind of making notes and kind of getting overwhelmed that I need to absorb all of this information. So something as simple as being able to have access to that keynote recording after an event so I can go away and then process that information in my own time allows me to sit in that room comfortably knowing that I can just enjoy the event how it is and take in that moment and be present.
In the piece, you describe accessibility as non-negotiable, which is kind of quite strong words, really. What made you choose those words?
I think I'm trying to convey the world in which my generation has grown up in. And this is, because of the generations before us who have advocated for a more inclusive world. I grew up in classrooms of children and I talk a lot about neurodivergency because that's from my lived experience, but this is across the board of accessibility, including, physical disabilities as well. But I grew up in a classroom that had a higher diagnostic rate for neurodiversity. So therefore, I understood that my friend over there had ADHD and they saw the world in a different way and they needed that support. And I understood that that person had dyspraxia, so they were better at this. And kind of you would go through your day-to-day at school understanding that people needed different things for different subjects. Therefore, coming out into the world outside of education, it's non-negotiable. That's my understanding. When I see my friend, I know that they're thriving in their job because that's their superpower for their part of their life. So that not being thought about and that not being included in events is not reflective of a world that we grew up in.
What you're saying about kind of neurodivergency and the different diagnoses. I mean, we've seen kind of an explosion of kind of people getting kind of later life kind of diagnoses. Do you think that's kind of having an effect?
Definitely. There's a lot of research at the moment going around as well for ladies who are going through menopause, and they're also getting diagnosed now for, ADHD and other neurodivergency, and they're then having to come to terms with this new diagnosis and this new way of life. For example, a lot of women who have masked maybe having ADHD throughout all of their life, as soon as they're going through menopause, those symptoms, if you like, are heightened and they no longer know how to interact with the world and where they belong in that. And I think we also obviously have a greater understanding of the different neurodivergency that you can have. Therefore, we are able to diagnose people as well. But in education, there still is people fighting to have their children be diagnosed so that they can have the access. So, it's not a crazy world where suddenly everyone's like, oh, you have this and you have this, and we all understand how it works. There's still people advocating to have formal diagnosis.
It's not really about Gen Z in a way. It's kind of like Gen Z maybe is simply the generation that's forcing the rest of us to catch up.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we are manifestations, if you like, of the older generation, and we just have a louder voice around it because our parents maybe advocated for us to understand that we all work differently. So therefore it's just, like I say, it's just our way of being.
Do you think that still maybe some older generations see, or sometimes see, accessibility as a nice to have, whereas your generation sees it as more a kind of a basic professionalism?
I think so, yes. And the reason I say that is because I think our event planning needs to develop. We need to learn more, and we need to be implementing more accessibility into our planning stages. I think it's the same in terms of, when there's new technology that comes into play, we then understand how to implement that into our events. And, we're evolving with the times. And I think our event planning and our event considerations need to keep up with that as well. It's not just that added on, it's inclusive into our planning.
Ideas about accessibility, kind of like we need to implement them, and in the same way that we might think about new technology.
Exactly. And I think AI is a very good example in terms of everyone has an over-awareness of it because it impacts our everyday. Maybe if accessibility isn't impacting your everyday, you're not as aware of it. Just because it's not impacting you doesn't mean that it's not impacting your attendees and the way in which they attend our events.
You were talking about kind of growing up in an environment where neurodiversity was more openly discussed. So do you think that's fundamentally changed your expectations of events?
Definitely. We've all got an understanding that although there are formal diagnoses out there, perhaps different people have different tendencies. Therefore, putting in access support across, our events is making an event more inclusive for everyone, not just those in which have the formal diagnosis. They talk a lot in education about teachers teaching a classroom full of children as though they all have learning difficulties. And then that's seen to then obviously help the rest of the children, not just those that do have the learning difficulties.
You describe yourself as a proud dyslexic.
Yes.
That has shaped the way you think about event design, hasn't it?
Yeah. For me, I know that it impacts the way in which I do my planning. So again, going back into sort of leaning into those superpowers, if you like, for me, a written form of communication is something that I can find quite challenging. So I much prefer, a spoken conversation like this. But it's also allowed me to really look into my attention to detail. So, for example, if someone's saying something, I know that I have to write down what you've said, which in turn produces a to-do list, which is, arguably the main part of an event planning is your to-do list, making sure you're ticking everything off. And I'm taking in that information, writing every single thing down so I can satisfy, highlight, and then cross that off. I think then how that in turn impacts my event planning in terms of for my attendees and for my clients is I personally have a real keen eye for the comms that we're sending out. If I'm looking at something, I'm understanding, is that digestible for me? Not only do I have dyslexia, but maybe someone's only got a quick 5 minutes and they need to quickly read that email. Can they pinpoint the kind of highlight bits that I'm trying to get them to look at, all the instructions, and kind of breaking it down in that way, rather than just thinking, this is the information that needs to be said. Maybe I need to add some pretty pictures and flowers so it's a bit more visual, and I'm highlighting the kind of key things around that.
Have there been any moments in your career where you've spotted barriers that maybe other people simply hadn't noticed?
Something I've considered really recently is networking. So we have obviously like a networking hour, well, sometimes in our agendas, and how inclusive that can be for someone who's neurodivergent. Not only are, you're going into a room in terms of it's just full of people, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of stimulation, you have to think of questions that you need to ask, and you can't always hear people as well. Those aren't necessarily super inclusive. I attended a talk at the meeting show, which was around neuro-inclusive networking. And Andy Williamson from Welcome Brain Diversity Consulting, he came up on stage and was talking about different implementations that you can put into your networking hours, which don't cost anything, but they're, helping everyone across the board. So looking at buddy systems in terms of, when you're walking into that room, that there's that kind of clutch point, if you like, that person that you can go to. So you don't just see a sea full of people and kind of don't know how to navigate that. Also simple things like adding an ask me question to your badge. So you've automatically got that kind of icebreaker when people are going into conversations. Also changing the word networking, that can feel quite overwhelming, that, in your agenda it says networking. Suddenly like, oh my goodness. So maybe, a consideration across someone's day is that they get to this hour, that they know that this networking hour is coming, and changing the name of that.
What would be a better word for networking?
What would be a better word for networking? I don't know.
No pressure chat.
No pressure. Yeah, exactly. And then ultimately, these small things, like I say, they don't just help the people who need the neuro-inclusive access support. That helps the room full of people. I don't really know anyone that would like to walk into a room and not know maybe what to ask people or how to start a conversation.
Do you ever find yourself walking into an event these days and instantly seeing about 10 things that could be done better?
Again, a lot of my personal lived experiences through communication, and that not being accessible for me. Also, if there's a keynote session, then perhaps there's not live captions running, or maybe they're not running kind of as smoothly as they can. And then something like that as well, that's helping people whose language isn't English, their first language not English as well. Or it might be helping if someone's speaking really quickly and people are struggling to follow along. That's another thing as well. You've got like a table full of name badges, and it's can you find your name, and then I'm having to take much longer to go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'm like, where would I sit along this table? Yeah.
One thing that really struck me was your criticism of the standard kind of registration question. Do you have any accessibility requirements? So why is that not good enough?
That question, and I really wrote about this, but that question can feel really overwhelming. And I think a lot of the time it makes for poor data collection unintentionally, because ultimately there's a lot of people that will be attending events and thinking, oh, I'll be fine. They'll have something, I'll be fine. And therefore they just kind of skip through that question. Whereas I think as event planners, we should start creating a question that shows people that we've thought about their access needs, but also kind of demonstrating what they could ask for. And that's why I kind of put the multiple question thing, because then people can go through and think, oh, do I need that? Do I need that? And then if there's an other box, they're like, oh, I might need this. I might need a bit of extra time here, but they've not necessarily said that, but they're kind of stipulating that is something that I could ask for. And then they'll feel more, not the word's not entitled, but they'll engage more with the question because they feel like they can. They won't be overstimulated by, do you have an access requirement? And it's no secret that as event planners, better data we collect, the better events that we produce. And that's across the board, data from our suppliers, data from previous events. So utilising our registrations, if we can, then it's just going to allow for more successful event, because we know what to anticipate and we know who's coming to our event. We're not making assumptions of what people need. We have that real live data to work with.
You introduced a term in the piece that you wrote that I'd never heard before, purple washing. Can you explain what you mean by that?
When writing the piece, I wanted accessibility to feel as digestible as possible. And I feel one of the best comparisons that we can draw is from sustainability. So reflecting on, where sustainability was about 5 years ago, we were starting to talk about it. We knew that it was really important. Then we started reporting on it and collecting data. And then we decided on actions on that. And now I feel like we're starting to get to the point where real actionable change is happening in the here and now. And I think that concept and applying that to accessibility feels very digestible and very accessible for people. And there's lots of things that we, are unintentionally doing in which we've not considered an attendee's full journey. So we've thought, for example, with physical disabilities, we've thought we know that the venue is accessible, So we've ticked that box, if you like. And again, it's unintentional. That's our understanding. And then we know that maybe there's a seat for them in which they can place their wheelchair in a large theatre. We've kind of got that understanding. And we've kind of worked out their journey in terms of how they will physically get from A to B. But perhaps we haven't considered what their experience is like. And that's the best example I can give in terms of accidental purple washing, where it's really quite obvious. And it's the same, like, people were very passionate about sustainability and right at the beginning, and there was a real lack of understanding of what that meant in terms of, was everyone saying, oh, is this just recycling? And we weren't considering what that truly meant across the whole of our event. So you would enter an event and you'd see a recycling bin, perfect, that's sustainability, ticked off, we know that we've done that. But they weren't considering maybe after the event what happens to all of the breakdown and where that goes. And it's that similar comparison that I can pull that I feel is really digestible. And I think there's a lot we can learn from how we've treated sustainability to expedite the accessibility journey and start implementing change right now, rather than thinking we need to start reporting on it, we need to start taking the information in. We can make actionable change now. And again, I wrote it in the article in the sense that we could take everything we're doing for sustainability, put accessibility in front of it, and we're halfway there. We do know what we need to do. That's training, really understanding what accessibility is and what differences people have and what support they might need.
With sustainability, I guess, as with accessibility, this kind of like, people might sometimes think they're doing something kind of that makes their event more accessible, but in reality, maybe it doesn't. Is that right?
In the sense that I think any effort towards making an event more accessible is great. And that's a really good starting point. And I think the more we progress through our learning and understanding of what accessibility is and what people need, the better our events will get ultimately. And that was the same with sustainability. We understood more. I think it's really important also to understand that accessibility isn't necessarily a one size fits all kind of approach. And that there are kind of sensitivities that we need to have around people's different lived experiences and the support that they might need.
I guess someone watching this might be thinking, well, this all sounds great, but clients don't always have the budget. How would you respond to that?
There are lots of accessibility changes that you can implement within your event that don't cost anything. Drawing back on the kind of networking ones that I was talking about, those don't necessarily cost anything. I think as well, so I was thinking the other day, a client was asking about a way in which they could better their networking hour, that they called it. And I was immediately thinking about those kind of practical tips that they were given on neuroinclusion and how that could help facilitate that. So that's a good example. I think we could probably look at a lot of the production elements in which we install into our main kind of keynote rooms as well. And instead of kind of putting in the best equipment that we've got and the best technology and the best lights and all this thing, actually, if we sat in that room, do we actually think that this is going to be more overstimulating than we ultimately intend it to be? And therefore, what can we perhaps strip back and use for that budget to put on live captions or things like that, and making maybe some of those slight changes as well. There's a lot of content that obviously goes up on the screen, of which a lot of the time our clients have produced. And I think we could look to advise them in a way to, again, going back to maybe like stimulation or making sure that the text is clear as possible. So for me growing up, they were trying a lot of giving me a white sheet of paper and putting a coloured lens over it, and whether or not I would kind of see that better. When we're looking at our kind of content and our PowerPoints on the stage, maybe looking at the background colours and the colours that we are projecting out to the audience, and whether or not they are, easy to read and follow.
What works best for you then?
Personally, a white background is not my best friend.
Okay.
If it's like a darker background, I know lots of people that I work with as well permanently change the colour of their screen, so it's on night shift. And I think those darker colours, I wonder if a lot of more people kind of have that preference as well.
Do you think people are often frightened of saying the wrong thing when it comes to accessibility?
Yes. And I think ultimately that's what kind of creates the stigma and the nervousness around having the conversation. I understand and I sympathise with the idea of saying the right or wrong thing, but I think there has to be a real understanding that it is very different person to person. And what you say for one person maybe not quite fit with the next. But not talking about it at all is creating a way bigger barrier. And I think it's important to understand how to talk about accessibility and maybe what kind of fits better with you and what sounds kind of right. For example, for me, I found over the past year, I met Sammy Boyd, who works at Live Nation in accessibility, and we constantly are jumping on calls kind of, monthly, weekly, just to have conversations around accessibility and kind of knowledge share and understand kind of where our industry is at. I've learned so much from her in having that safe space and understanding people's stories and kind of things from that way. I also think I was listening to one of these podcasts as well where it talks about how we're in the niche, aren't we? So we're obviously meeting and incentive travel. That's our kind of like event niche, if you like. But there's lots that we can learn from live music events and the work that Sammy does at Live Nation with regards to, a lot of the live performances we see now have sign language and people talking that way. And there's also kind of platforms in which people with wheelchairs can go and sit upon and they can see out. And there's lots of changes that they've made and that they automatically implement into their events that we could learn from. There's also kind of more accreditation around those live events as well that perhaps our industry could start to look at as well.
Do you think sometimes we talk about accessibility maybe as something we do for different groups rather than something that simply makes events better for everyone?
Yes, I've recently read, and I was talking to a colleague about this because they noted that I wrote the word accommodate within my article, and kind of since having this conversation with her, I've read up on it, and there's lots around how the word accommodate puts the onus on the person attending the event rather than the event planner themselves. So then when you're saying, is it for people rather than for everyone? I think, we've accommodated that. We've ticked that box rather than we've implemented this and we know it's going to help kind of everyone coming.
What do you think we'll look back on in 5 or 10 years' time and wonder why we ever accepted that in terms of accessibility?
Accessibility is a worldly kind of a journey that we're all going through. But there's a real opportunity to create an event in which everyone can attend and there's no barriers within that. And I think not seeing that as an opportunity. I think I spoke about the social model of disability, and I was recently talking to a lady whose son is autistic, and they attended a SEN event, so kind of sensory festival. And for that one day, she was in a world in which her son had no barriers and, no one was looking at them. There was the quiet rooms, there were ambassadors that you could go talk to, and without any questions asked, you could say, could you look after my child? I just need to have a minute. Or could you look after? And there was no questions asked. And for that one day, that world had no barriers for her son, nor her. And I think the same with events in terms of what are we currently allowing our attendees to not put up with, but kind of make do with, in which we don't need to do that. We can show that we've thought about them and we can give them the support that they need.
We can give every attendee that same experience that woman and her son had of kind of feeling like there were no barriers.
Exactly. And then she's also come away from that event thinking that was amazing. That's exactly what we want our attendees to be doing, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's kind of the whole point, isn't
it? Exactly.
Are there any accessibility features that you think are going to just become completely standard in the future? Just
completely standard. Live captions, I think, is a really good example. I think live recordings as well. I really hope that is a standard as well, that people can take away that material when they go away from it. I think we might start looking at I know we already are looking at our agendas very differently and how we're placing activities to give people more downtime, whether or not that's downtime to kind of step away from being around so many voices, or if that's downtime for you to carry on with your work, so that's not something that you're considering as well. I think we're going to lay out our events very differently.
Do you think length of session is
definitely
is a thing? I've noticed there's an upcoming trade show that has limited its kind of sessions to 20-25 minutes.
Yeah.
Because that's the length of time that people like to consume things in.
My brain, for example, to take in the level of information that's kind of being given at me is having to work a lot harder, and I will get a lot tired a lot quicker than perhaps someone who's kind of easier, neurotypical when they're taking that information kind of as it comes through. So being able to shorten those sessions allows me then to have a bit more time to, again, digest that information, take in what it is, but also just have a little bit of a rest because I'm having to work just a little bit harder to, again, process that information in the same way.
If you could change one thing across the entire industry tomorrow to do with accessibility, what would it be?
I think accessible accreditations, and I think really utilising those opportunities to be audited as an event of how inclusive you are being through accessibility, kind of across the board. I think we could standardise that. I know that it couldn't happen tomorrow because we'd need the right consultants and the right people sort of leading that, but sort of creating that standard that we currently don't have. There's so much uncertainty of what that level of standard should be that we can then work upon, that to then create that and create accreditations where people kind of understand, we have that sustainability ISO and you can have that as a whole company as well. It's not just about our attendees, but also about the workplace and how are we setting that up to make sure that our employees are being as productive as possible and as thriving in these environments the same way anyone else would.
Everyone would want that accreditation, wouldn't they? I guess kind of like the best accessible event shouldn't really feel like an accessible event. It should just feel like a brilliantly designed event. Is that what we're concluding?
Yeah, I agree. I think an event in which everyone is allowed to engage with the material in the same way. Ultimately, our attendees coming away from the event having taken in the information and we've achieved the objective that our client wanted to, and there's not been a thought across that of my need wasn't met or I really struggled with this part and now I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z to kind of keep up.
I was just wondering, Freya, is there any times you've been at an event and you've kind of, you felt dissatisfied with what was going on in terms of accessibility, you had to leave a session early or kind of just felt not included?
I have attended an event before where we were told that the material we would have that after, and then that wasn't kind of obviously given to us after. So then my then view on the event coming away from it was different to then how I experienced it, if that makes sense. I've been sat in a keynote room and it's all kind of on to the one next thing, and you're sat in there for hours on end, and it's kind of, and I'm there frantically typing away to make sure that I'm taking away the information because what was being said on stage was brilliant and stuff that I would love to implement. But because it was kind of on to the next thing and on to the next thing, and I couldn't take that information the same way. And I also felt like I really stood out when I was sat there typing in my notes as well, because everyone else was able to just sit there and listen.
And so you do actually kind of listen to the recordings afterwards then?
Yeah,
as well?
absolutely, absolutely. And it's the same with my colleagues as well. I know people that need to record meetings and then to take that information away and then to process kind of what's been said there and make that actionable. We're all wanting to kind of produce the best work and do the best we can. So whatever way kind of works for us in process, then we should be doing that.
Thank you so much for joining me in the meeting room today, Freya.
Thank you for having me.